They said he died alone, the kind of death that leaves a man with no mourners, no prayers, no one to put a hand on his coffin when the dirt closed over him. In the Old West, a man's funeral was often the only measure of his life, a final judgment made by neighbors, friends, and enemies alike. And when his day came, no one showed. The preacher stood there with a Bible in his hands, the wind tugging at his coat, and looked out at a field of empty chairs. The gravedigger leaned on his shovel, waiting, his eyes on the horizon, as if someone might still come riding in. But no one did. Not a single soul. It was as if the earth itself was ashamed to take him back. The man's name, depending on who told the story, was either Elijah Harper or Thomas Gray, or sometimes just the loner. Legends blur over time, especially when they involve a figure people would rather forget. What everyone agreed on was that he was a gunman, the kind who lived on the edge of the law, sometimes working for sheriffs, sometimes riding with outlaws, sometimes just drifting from town to town with his revolvers polished and his eyes sharp. He'd killed men, too many for anyone to count, and not all of them had it coming. Maybe that's why no one came. He wasn't loved, he wasn't respected, and when the end finally claimed him, whether by fever, bullet, or whiskey, the town decided to let him go alone. The grave was dug shallow, as was often the case in those days. Wood was scarce, and so was time. The coffin looked more like a box nailed together in haste than a vessel fit to carry a man into eternity. The preacher said a few words, voice thin against the prairie wind, words about sin and forgiveness that seemed to fall flat in the emptiness around him, and then it was done. The dirt fell, the grave was filled, and the town went on with its business, relieved that a dangerous man had finally gone quiet. But that wasn't the end of the story, because that night, as the clock in the saloon struck 12, something stirred on the horizon. Men in town later swore they heard it before they saw it. The thunder of hooves, faint at first, then rising like a storm. Horses galloping, riders shouting low, a sound that carried through the empty streets and rattled windows in their frames. The few men awake at that hour, gamblers still clutching cards or drunks stumbling out of saloons, stepped into the street and squinted at the darkness. And that's when they saw them. A line of riders, black against the moonlight, charging hard down the road that led straight to the cemetery. No faces could be seen beneath the wide-brimmed hats, no flesh caught the glint of the lantern light. Just shadows on horseback, moving with purpose, the kind of purpose that belongs to men on a mission. Some swore their horses left no tracks. Others said the riders didn't make a sound at all, that the thunder of hooves was only in their ears, an echo of something long past. But whatever they were, they rode straight to the fresh grave. The town kept its distance. No one dared follow, not even the boldest drunk with whiskey fire in his belly. They just watched from porches and windows as the riders circled the grave in silence, their horses stomping, breath misting in the cold night air. Some said they dismounted, heads bowed, standing like mourners at a funeral that had been denied in daylight. Others whispered that they didn't dismount at all, that they simply sat their horses in a ring, looking down at the dirt, their faces hidden, their silence heavier than words, and then, as suddenly as they had come, they turned and rode off, back into the desert, back into the night, vanishing into the horizon as if the earth had swallowed them whole. The grave lay undisturbed, the town lay silent, and the people who had seen it swore they would never forget the sight of those midnight riders coming for a man no one else would claim. The legend spread quick, because that's how things worked in the West. A story told over whiskey in one town found its way to another by morning, and by the time a week had passed, folks hundreds of miles away were whispering about the dead gunman whose funeral no one attended, except for the riders who came at midnight. Some believed they were his old gang, riding from beyond the grave to pay their respects. Others thought they were the spirits of the men he'd killed, come to make sure he stayed buried. And some swore they were demons, black riders who haunted the frontier, taking souls who didn't get proper burials. What makes the story linger isn't just the mystery of who those riders were. It's the fact that men swore they saw them, and not just in one town, not just in one graveyard, but in others too. Variations of the tale popped up across the frontier, from Texas to Montana. A hated sheriff, a crooked banker, a gambler who cheated too many men. All of them said to have been buried without mourners, and all of them, supposedly, visited by the midnight riders. Every town had a version, and every man who told it insisted it was true, or at least that his uncle's cousin's partner had seen it with his own eyes. The midnight riders became part of cowboy lore, the kind of thing told around campfires when the fire burned low and the coyotes howled. Men would laugh at first, but when the wind picked up and the horses shifted uneasily, they'd grow quiet, glancing over their shoulders into the darkness. Because if there was one thing every cowboy understood, it was that the West was full of shadows, and sometimes shadows rode horses too. What's striking is how often the story returned to the same theme: a man who lived without honor, dying without mourners, yet receiving a funeral all the same. Who were the riders? Old friends, old enemies, or something else entirely? Some cowboys believed they were reminders, a warning that no man escapes judgment. You might die alone, you might be forgotten by the living, but the dead remember, and they ride at midnight to make sure you are not left unclaimed. That belief ran deep. Even men who didn't claim to believe in ghosts admitted they would never laugh at the story. Too many swore it true, and too many had their own reasons to wonder what kind of riders might come for them when the time came. Death was close in the West, closer than a shadow, quicker than a bullet, and the thought that someone, anyone, might come riding for you when the living turned away was both comforting and terrifying. The story of the funeral no one attended was not just about one man. It became a parable, a lesson wrapped in mystery told in saloons, bunkhouses, and around the glow of dying fires. And every time it was told, the details shifted, but the image remained the same. Midnight, a fresh grave, and riders appearing from nowhere to mark the passing of a soul left alone by the living. The strangest thing about the story was how quickly it spread, and how many versions of it surfaced across the frontier. Cowboys riding from Texas to Colorado swore they heard whispers of the midnight riders, and each telling added new shadows to the tale. Some said the riders came only for men who'd lived by the gun and died with blood on their hands. Others insisted they came for anyone denied the dignity of a funeral. And a few, in hushed voices, claimed the riders weren't mourners at all, but collectors, taking something from the grave that the living couldn't see. In Arizona, a prospector told of a gambler buried outside town after being caught cheating one too many times. His grave was shallow, dug in rocky earth, and the preacher muttered words so quick it was clear he wanted the business over with. That night, as the moon rose, the town marshal swore he heard horses on the edge of town. By the time he reached the cemetery, he said a dozen riders had gathered, their shapes barely visible in the silver light. They sat silent, their heads bowed, until one of them leaned down and touched the fresh mound of earth. The marshal said he heard a sound like a whisper carried on the wind, though he could never repeat what it said. When he blinked, the riders were gone. The grave looked untouched, except for a single playing card stuck upright in the dirt, a black ace that hadn't been there before. In New Mexico, the story shifted. A gunslinger named Cole Danner died in a saloon brawl, shot through the chest by a man he didn't even see coming. He'd been feared and hated, a bully with a quick hand and a cruel smile, and no one in town wanted to bury him. Still, the law required it, so a grave was dug and his body laid down in silence. That night, riders came, but these weren't silent mourners. According to the men who watched from a distance, they came shouting, their voices echoing like thunder, their horses rearing and pawing at the earth. They circled the grave 3 times, then vanished into the desert in a cloud of dust. The next morning, Danner's grave was open, the coffin lid splintered and his body missing. Some claimed coyotes had dragged him off. Others swore the riders had taken him, carrying him into a darkness deeper than death. Not all the stories were about villains. In Montana, a ranch hand named Will Carver died of fever, far from family, far from anyone who cared enough to ride out and see him buried. His fellow ranchers dug the hole and put him in the ground without much ceremony, a simple marker of wood and his name scratched into it with a knife. But that night, cowboys said they saw riders approach, not grim shadows, but bright figures, almost glowing in the starlight. They sat their horses around the grave as if standing guard, and some swore they heard the faint sound of hymn singing carried on the wind. In the morning, the grave was covered in wildflowers no one had planted. It seemed, at least to those men, that sometimes the midnight riders came not to punish or to claim, but to honor. What tied all these stories together was the certainty with which men told them. The Old West was full of tall tales, but this was different. When cowboys spoke of the riders, they spoke with lowered voices, with eyes that glanced toward the horizon. They didn't laugh as they did with ghost stories or poker lies. They swore these riders were real, and many believed the day would come when they'd see them for themselves. And there was another detail, whispered more than spoken outright. Some claimed the riders could be summoned, not by choice but by circumstance. If a man died without anyone to stand over his grave, if the earth took him in silence, then the riders would come. It was their duty, or their curse, to appear when the living had abandoned the dead. Cowboys who believed this made sure to always speak a word over a body, even if it was just a quick prayer or a muttered farewell. Better to give the dead something, they said, than to risk calling down those who rode at midnight. Skeptics had their own explanations. Some said it was just drunken imagination, cowboys weaving stories out of shadows and moonlight. Others blamed tricks of the desert, where sounds carried strangely and shapes appeared distorted. A few claimed bands of outlaws used the legend to scare townsfolk, riding at night in silence to make themselves seem like spirits. And yet, the skeptics could never explain the little details. The ace of spades left at a grave, the flowers that appeared overnight, the bodies gone missing. Too many stories carried those strange marks, things no ordinary outlaw could account for. And the legend grew darker still. A few whispered of men who weren't buried at all, left on the prairie where they fell. In those cases, the riders didn't wait until midnight. They came sooner, their hoofbeats rattling the air, their voices carrying on the wind. One cowboy swore he watched as the riders surrounded a body left in the dust. He said they dismounted, picked the corpse up in silence, and carried it away across their saddles. When morning came, there was no trace of the dead man, no tracks in the dirt, as if the riders had never been there. Even lawmen spoke of them. A sheriff in Kansas told of burying a stagecoach robber alone with no preacher and no mourners. That night he woke to the sound of horses outside his window. Looking out, he saw the riders passing through town, heading straight for the graveyard. He didn't follow, said his legs wouldn't move, like the very sight of them rooted him to the floor. In the morning, the grave was still there, but the marker had been burned black. The sheriff carried that image with him for the rest of his days, and every time he buried another man, no matter how wicked, he made sure someone was there to speak a word. What unsettled folks most was the question of who the riders were. Were they outlaws themselves, cursed to ride forever, seeking company in the graves of the forgotten? Were they angels, coming to give the dead the respect the living denied? Or were they something darker, spirits bound to the earth feeding on those abandoned by men? No one could say for sure, and maybe that was the point. The riders weren't meant to be understood. They were meant to be feared, respected, remembered. For cowboys, the story carried a lesson. Live as you will, die as you must, but don't think the end comes quietly. If no one comes to mourn you, someone else might. And whoever they are, you won't want to meet them in the moonlight. The legend of the midnight riders seeped into the bones of the West, carried in whispers, etched into campfire tales. Men who had seen them never forgot, and men who hadn't still rode with the thought in the back of their minds that one day, if their luck ran out and no one came to stand by their grave, they might hear hoofbeats on the wind, drawing closer, closer, until the ground shook and the shadows came riding in. The further the story traveled, the less it was just a ghost tale, and the more it became a code that shaped how men behaved on the frontier. Out there, death was never far away. A man could be alive at sunrise and gone by sundown, cut down by a bullet, a fever, a rattlesnake, or just the harsh land itself. And because death came so sudden, the legend of the midnight riders carried a kind of weight. Cowboys might not believe in many things, but they didn't take chances with spirits. So they learned to bury their dead differently, not because of the law or religion, but because of fear. Fear that if a man was laid in the ground without dignity, the riders would come. It was said that trail crews would stop everything to give a dead cowboy a proper send-off. Even if they had no preacher, they'd stand in a circle, remove their hats, and say a few words. Sometimes it was only a sentence. He rode with us and worked hard, but they swore that was enough to keep the riders away. A grave left in silence was an invitation. A grave with words over it was a barrier. That was the belief. Some towns began to see the legend as more than superstition. In Kansas, one newspaper even wrote that the riders were the conscience of the frontier. They forced men to treat the dead with respect, even those who hadn't earned it. It wasn't about justice. It was about fear of what rode in the dark. But like every tale, there were darker layers that people didn't share in polite company. Around campfires, when the night was too quiet, men spoke of the unlucky ones who'd actually seen the riders up close enough to make out their faces. One story came from Nevada, where a miner swore he saw the riders gather around the grave of his partner. He hid behind a boulder and watched. At first he thought the riders were ordinary men, dressed in dusters and wide-brimmed hats, but when the moonlight hit their faces he realized they had none. Just shadows where eyes and mouths should be, shifting like smoke. He ran, and he kept running, and he said he never stopped hearing the sound of those hoofbeats chasing him, even weeks later, when he was hundreds of miles away. Another story told in Texas was even stranger. A drifter was found half-mad, wandering into town without his horse. He told anyone who'd listen that the riders had come for him, not someone dead, not a grave, but him. He'd been riding alone, he said, when the night turned colder than ice and the wind fell still. Then he heard them, hoofbeats rolling like thunder. He saw their shapes crest a ridge riding in silence, and they circled him like wolves. He claimed they didn't touch him, but when dawn broke, his horse was gone and his saddle was empty. He had no memory of how he ended up walking into town. Folks didn't know what to make of it. Some said he'd gone mad from thirst. Others said maybe the riders had taken the horse's payment for sparing his life. Whatever the truth, he refused to ever ride alone again. The more these stories spread, the harder it became to tell where truth ended and fear began. Were the riders guardians? Spirits of vengeance? Or something stranger still, creatures bound to the frontier itself? Men argued over it, but one thing no one argued about was the power of the tale. It changed behavior. It made the most ruthless gunfighters pause before leaving a man unburied. It gave cowboys a reason to whisper prayers they barely believed in. It made the loneliest drifters hope, in the quietest corners of their hearts, that when their time came, anyone would be there to speak a word over them. There were even places where the riders became part of local ritual. In one Colorado town, whenever someone died, the sheriff would make sure at least 12 men stood at the grave. Not because the dead needed it, he said, but because the living did. They needed to be reminded that death wasn't just an end. It was a crossing, and if you didn't mark that crossing, someone else would. Another town in New Mexico went further. When an outlaw died, they left his boots outside his grave, turned upside down. The belief was that if the riders came, they'd see the boots and know the man had been accounted for, and they'd ride past. It was a small gesture, but men swore it kept the hoofbeats away. And yet, no matter how much respect they gave the dead, the stories never stopped. In fact, they multiplied. There was the tale of a preacher in Oklahoma who swore he saw the riders not around a grave but riding through town in the dead of night, silent as the grave, their horses making no sound on the dirt road. When morning came, the preacher found that one of his parishioners had died in her sleep. He claimed the riders hadn't been coming for a grave, they'd been escorting a soul. Others told stories of riders that could be seen only by children, or by the dying themselves, appearing at the edge of vision as the last breath rattled out. Skeptics tried to reason it out. They said these were just stories to explain away the randomness of death on the frontier. But even skeptics couldn't deny that the tale had a strange kind of power. It gave shape to the loneliness of the West, where men lived hard and died harder, often forgotten by all but the dust. The riders became the face of that loneliness, the embodiment of what it meant to be abandoned, and the warning of what waited if no one remembered you. Some even wondered if the riders weren't ghosts at all, but memories. The West was full of the dead, scattered across prairies and canyons. Maybe, people said, the land itself remembered. Maybe the riders were the land's way of making sure no one was left completely alone. It was a comforting thought, but also a terrifying one. Because if the land could remember the dead, maybe it could remember the living too and keep a reckoning none of us wanted to see. By the late 1800s, the legend of the Midnight Riders had become as much a part of frontier lore as Billy the Kid or Jesse James. Newspapers hinted at it in editorials, dime novels picked it up, and cowboys carried it with them wherever they roamed. And with each telling, the story grew stranger, darker, and more alive. Men no longer asked if the riders were real. They asked when they would see them, and so we circle back to the story that gave the legend its sharpest edge. The one cowboys whispered about most often when the fire burned low. When the desert was so quiet, it made every man shift in his saddle. The tale of the outlaw whose funeral no one dared attend, and the riders who came instead. His name was Elias Turner, though some called him Black Elias. He wasn't a man who inspired kindness or respect. He was a hired gun, meaner than most, and stories said he'd killed more than 20 men across Texas and New Mexico. Some said he never smiled, some said he never prayed, and some swore they saw him laugh, while another man bled out at his feet. The law couldn't hold him, and the townsfolk wouldn't mourn him. He lived by the pistol and carried himself like he feared nothing on earth. But in the end, death finds everyone. The story goes that Elias was caught in a shootout near the Pecos River. He killed 3 men before a bullet caught him in the gut. He bled for hours, cursing every breath, and when the light left his eyes, there wasn't a soul who wept. His body was dragged into town like a dead animal, thrown onto a wagon and dumped into a shallow grave at the edge of the cemetery. No preacher, no words, no farewell. The men who covered him with dirt spat on the mound when they were finished. And then they left, as though wiping their hands of the whole business. That night the town was silent. Too silent. Men who lived nearby swore they woke in the dark to a sound rolling low across the ground. Hoofbeats, not one horse but many. Steady, in unison, like the march of an army. Those who dared to look out their windows saw figures riding slow through the streets, heading toward the graveyard. Some said there were 12. Some swore there were 20. All agreed they rode with no sound but their horses, their faces hidden in shadow, their eyes glowing faint as embers. They gathered around Elias's grave. No one was brave enough to get close, but from porches and windows, townsfolk watched as the riders sat their horses in a circle. Some swore they heard voices low and mournful, like chanting carried by the wind. Others said there was only silence heavier than death itself. For nearly an hour they remained unmoving, watching that mound of dirt as though keeping vigil. Then, without a word, they turned and rode out into the night, disappearing into the desert as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. When morning came, the grave looked different. The dirt was smoothed, as though carefully tended. And stuck in the center of the mound was a single object. Elias's gun upright in the soil, its barrel pointed at the sky. It had been buried with him, but now it stood like a marker, polished clean though no hand had touched it. Some claimed it gleamed as if new. Others whispered it was hot to the touch as if it had just been fired. The town was shaken. Men who had spit on Elias's grave now crossed themselves when they walked past. No one admitted it aloud, but everyone feared what it meant. The riders had come for a man hated by all, a man denied even the smallest prayer. They had given him what the living would not, a vigil, a marker, a recognition, and in doing so, they had reminded everyone in that dusty town that death was not theirs to decide. From then on, things changed. Men who once scoffed at the legend made sure to speak words over every grave, even for strangers. Preachers gained a new respect, hired not for the sake of God but to keep the riders at bay, and every time someone was buried, folks glanced nervously at the horizon when the sun set, listening for the drum of hoofbeats on the wind. That story, more than any other, is why the Midnight Riders lived on in Western lore. It wasn't just that they came for Elias Turner. It was that they came when no one else would. They gave him the dignity denied by the living. And whether you saw them as spirits of mercy or shadows of vengeance, one thing was clear. The riders did not tolerate the forgotten. Cowboys said it best. You don't get to choose if they come. You only get to choose if you're remembered by men or by them. And that's why, to this day, the tale of the Midnight Riders isn't told with laughter. It's told with a glance at the dark horizon, with the soft shuffle of boots in the dirt, with a voice lowered just enough to suggest that maybe, just maybe, someone is listening. The legend never died with the frontier. It followed America into the 20th century, whispered in mining camps and on lonely ranches. Even today, some claim the riders can still be heard in lonely places, the rhythmic pounding of hooves on ground where no horse should be. People say the West holds on to its dead tighter than anywhere else. And when the living let go too quickly, the riders come to take their place. So when you hear the story of Elias Turner, remember this. His funeral was empty, his grave abandoned, his name cursed. But at midnight, the riders came. They always come. And if you ever find yourself in the silence of the desert night, and you hear hoofbeats where no horse rides, you might want to bow your head and whisper a prayer. Not for yourself, but for the dead. Because if you don't, the riders just might come to remind you why no grave should ever be left alone.